Welcome to our fourth episode of Dev Bootcamp Live. This is a podcast for new software engineers where we help you level up so you can land your first job. Or even if you already landed your first job, we help you level up so you can be the best software engineer on your team. We are going live in new platforms every week. So now we are on, and I'm going to grab my list here, Overcast, we're on Pocket Cast, Anchor.fm, Spotify, Radio Public, we're on Apple Podcasts, Castro FM, of course, we are here on YouTube. So yeah, whatever platform you're on, click the follow button, subscribe. We are publishing new content every week. So yeah, so this is your host, Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter.
And today, Jared has a very exciting topic for us. I mean, he always brings exciting topics. So Jared, go ahead. What's the topic for today?
Yeah, so the topic today is Juan and I are going to be discussing best practices in HTML. Oftentimes, I feel HTML gets ignored behind JavaScript. As you know, everyone's focused on JavaScript or the latest framework, but today we're going to kind of pull it back a little bit and focus on the foundations of HTML and how to write the best HTML. So the format is we're just going to be bringing up different topics and be sharing them. As always, we haven't talked about these before. This is entirely a natural discussion here. So let's go ahead and, let's go ahead and jump right into it then.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So yeah, since you wrote the topic, Jared, you got to start. So what's the first thing our audience should know about HTML best practices? Like that important thing they need to know.
Yeah. So number one is, and this is kind of a new topic that came around with HTML5, is this idea of semantic HTML. And everyone's wondering, hey, what the heck is semantic HTML? The shortest explanation of it is that it conveys meaning about what the element is doing. And this is really important for three reasons. One, it's really important for other developers when they're maintaining your code. They can understand the meaning that you're conveying. It's also really good for search engines to understand the content on your site and how to index it so that it can be found correctly. And third, also for accessibility and screen readers. People with disabilities rely on websites being written in a way with semantic elements. So Juan, why don't you tell us a little bit about what some examples of semantic elements?
Yeah, semantic elements, like one of the basic ones is, for example, when you're creating a form, a lot of people like to use, for example, divs and have the divs styled as a button. And yeah, that's great. You create great forms like that. But the problem is, remember, not everybody has the same capabilities or the same machines or the same, skills that everybody, that people have in general, right? I don't know if you knew, but I believe that, I think that 30% of the population has some sort of disability, right? So many people use screen readers, right? Many people need to have higher contrast and stuff like that. So for example, by using semantic HTML, use native elements without having, you can style them, but by using, for example, instead of using a div or a link as a button, you use an actual button, then you're getting out of the box all this accessibility, because a screen reader is going to allow to navigate these forms that you are creating. So it's really, really powerful because you get all this out of the box. But if you are, because if you're not using it, then you have to do other things like use maybe area, right? That this area tags to tell the screen reader what the element is, but it's kind of hard to remember all this stuff, right? So just using semantic HTML, you get this out of the box. So that's kind of like a powerful thing. And I always think of forms. Forms, it's like those always have, you got to get them right.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I entirely agree. With kind of keeping on with a little bit with the accessibility there, I think there's also a couple of other considerations of when you're creating, HTML. In addition to the ARIA tags that Juan mentioned, if you don't know what those are, go ahead and take a look at what those are about. But there's a handful of other little bits in accessibility to consider. Things like alt text, the ALT text on an HTML element, or on an image element, right? Again, people who are disabled or visually impaired might not be able to see your image, so you want to be able to provide a description for that. There's also something called tab ordering. So again, a lot of disabled people will use the tab key to go through the different elements. Well, you can actually specify in HTML, in case you didn't know, the order of where the tab goes. And then lastly, I would say avoiding images with too much text on them, or even in general, without some sort of ARIA descriptor or alt text as well. In general, if you're given by your designer basically an image with a bunch of text on it, consider actually building that in HTML and typing out the values to make it more friendly for accessibility reasons.
Yeah, that's good. And I think we're supposed to say like people with a disability. I mean, I think I heard this last year. I don't think we're supposed to say disabled people. I know.
Oh,
I
pardon
think
me.
people with
Yeah,
disability or
people with
handicapped. I
disabilities.
think, but
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I
Pardon.
just heard that like last year. But I mean, I'm not really sure. So, okay, perfect. No, that's really good. So yeah, I want to dive in with some HTML best practices. So one, like I like to start simple. So I mean, HTML is supposed to be simple, right? So one of the things is like a lot of engineers, they take the head, right? Head tag for granted, right? I want to talk about the head tag. Like head is very important for different reasons. For example, for SEO purposes, right? Search engine optimization. So for the head, like for example, one of the first things you gotta set up when you're creating whatever page you're doing or whatever application, it's the viewport. Okay, why? Because when you create your website, you know, like right now, I think it's like over 70% of the traffic to any website usually comes from mobile devices. I mean, that's kind of like the reality today. We live in a world where we access everything from our phone. So the viewport is going to help set this responsiveness for your site, right? Because you're going to be able to see the site still look nice, right? Instead of looking all zoomed out and super small, right? The viewport really helps with that. So that's one of the things you got to have. The second thing you got to have, I mean, there's a lot of elements you need on the head, but like the second important thing I want to mention just right now is the title. I mean, you have to have a title tag, right? And this is also for SEO purposes, right? And it's an important tag, right? And one important one also, like that has to go with the head, right? That actually improves kind of like the bookmarks, right? When you're creating bookmarks, is the Fab icon. So you can add a meta tag there, right? And you said the Fab icon, and this is the icon that when people save your website, your bookmark, right? They're going to have that icon there. So that's how you set it. So it's kind of like just 3 lines, and I mean, and you can have all this out of the box, right? You have SEO, right? You have because the title of the page, and you have the icon, which is how people will see your website there. So those are 3 things that I would like to share just right now. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be clear there, for what, in case anyone doesn't know what the title tag does, the title tag is what changes the text up in the browser, up in the tab at the top, to show correctly, along with the favicon.
Yeah,
just to make that a little bit clear.
Don't use JavaScript to change the title. I mean, like if you're building something out of the box yourself, like I mean, not out of the like yourself, like you can set the title without having to do JavaScript, right? If you're using a framework, a library, then if the library does that, good. Okay, they manage those things. But usually when it's changed by JavaScript and there's no server-side rendering, you don't get the search engine optimization benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So definitely recommend go check out the head tag and everything you can do about it. I know in VS Code, when you start typing in HTML and hit tab for HTML5, it gives you a couple of the viewport and the title kind of out of the box, and you just kind of have to set them. But yeah, really, really great points there to check out. And also a distinction, the head is different than the header element, which is a semantic element for generally describing the header on your web page. Where the head is a non-visual element on your page.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's really great. Yeah, now I wanted to bring things back a little bit to HTML attributes, because I think there's actually a lot of different HTML attributes that you can apply to your elements to do a lot of things that come right out of the box with HTML5 that have nothing to do with JavaScript. You know, a few different examples are, so a lot of them have to live in forms and input elements and things like that, but some of them are outside of that. So for example, in forms, on an input element, you can add all sorts of different validation attributes to your input elements. Now, these aren't the prettiest when you go to submit, but for something that's out of the box and just ready to use, these validation attributes are really helpful. So I definitely recommend students go and learn about them and practice about them, HTML input attributes, and explore them.
And that reminds me, there's an interview question that usually people like to ask, which is like, what are the required attributes for the IMG tag, right? And usually it's kind of like, okay, this is required attributes. Well, we know that one is source, SRC, right? But what is the other one? Do you happen to know, Jared? This one is a hard one. Yes,
No?
it's
Oh,
alt.
okay.
Yes. So if you
Okay.
look the specification, alt is a required attribute for the IMG tag. Most engineers don't know this, and if you don't include it, nothing is gonna break. The browser is smart, and your pages is still gonna work. But this is one of those things. Like knowing these things will help you out, right? And now you know this, and you are always gonna have an alt attribute on your IMG tag. Cool. So I have Okay, so the next one I want to talk about, and this one is also is very related to HTML, right? Building upon the HTML semantic elements you already mentioned, which is super important. But there's two things I like to talk about when it comes to HTML. Like you really want to be the best engineer, and you know, let's say you know all the elements, you know already how to do HTML. It's not that hard, right? But there's some things that come along with that. When you're creating HTML, there's two things that I like you to, I want you to always remember. The first thing, always do an ad blocker test. So if you don't know about ad blockers, there are these extensions that block ads on your website. But sometimes if you don't test your website, right, or your application with an ad block, right, with an ad blocker enabled, like for example, Adblock Plus, then your clients, your customers might run into issues because they're probably using these extensions. They're very popular today. So you always have, as an engineer, you have to do a test like where you have the ad blocker enabled and you make sure that everything blocks and is not blocking third-party libraries that you're using and that your site is still working. And the second thing I want to share is you should be using a link checker, right, for your HTML, because these link checkers, like for example, I use WebStorm, it's a JetBrains IDE, and that one, for example, if I forget the alt attribute in IMG, it's gonna tell me, Juan, you're forgetting that, and it tells me to add it. So it reminds all these rules and specifications and best practices that I cannot remember myself because there's so many, right? So those are the two things that really help me write better, clean HTML. Having the link check enabled, right? Link checkers, there's a lot of tools for that. And of course, do the ad block test always on whatever you build. So I always have it enabled because I know like, okay, my application is always running. So I don't have to fix it at the end in case something breaks. And believe me, this has affected me in production environments, having the ad block enabled, getting third-party libraries blocked. So Jared, what do you think of these two tips here I'm sharing for best practices when it comes to HTML?
Yeah, absolutely. The first point of basically being able to test your website in a variety of different ways with an ad block installed, but just to add a few other things, making sure that it's mobile friendly, make sure it's mobile responsive, and make sure it looks good. Make sure it looks good on an Android phone and an Apple phone, because I've seen discrepancies between the mobile browsers on those platforms. But just making sure you're testing it out in a variety of ways to make sure that it's going to be a consistent experience for your users is definitely going to be key there. And yeah, I know Visual Studio Code, I can't think of them, any on the top of my head, but that there's extensions and tools that you can install in other IDEs as well to enforce rules, these linting rules to make sure that you're not missing your alt tag on your images. Or for example, I ran into an issue yesterday with a student where in React, they actually complain to you if you have an opening and closing input element tag, because the input element tag does not have an opening and
Doesn't
closing.
have
It's
one.
a self-closing element.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Especially in React, that there are a lot of elements that are self-closing too, right? Because it's JSX. I've seen that too. Like I've seen those errors, but yeah. Okay, so Jared, I'm gonna take a little pause and I'm gonna share our tweeters. I'm gonna go ahead and share here. So if you are watching on YouTube, I mean, you can see on the screen, right? I'm sharing our tweeters, but for whoever is listening out there, for our audience listening on any of the other platforms, follow us on Twitter. We're posting good content every week, right? And we're sharing tips, and if you want to tweet about this podcast, we will greatly appreciate it. If you can also suggest topics that you would like us to cover. So my Twitter is Juan Lizarazo. You can find me at twitter.com/Juan Lizarazo G. So that's JUANLIZARAZOG. Okay, so it's kind of hard to spell, but you're gonna find the link to these on the description of these podcasts on whatever platform you're listening to.
Yeah, and everybody can find me at twitter.com/Jared Potter. That's JAREDPOTTER. And go ahead and follow me and tweet at me.
Yeah, we engage with us there. Like we will reply to whatever comments, to direct messages. I mean, we are one message away. So yeah, and that will show us your support as well. Yeah, remember the links are available in the description of whatever platform you're listening this on, okay, or you're watching this on. So perfect. Okay, Jared. So what would be the next tip you would like to share regarding?
Yeah, so I have a handful of probably, of smaller bits that I'd also like to share of things I've just learned over the years. And I'd love to hear your opinion, or maybe if you have a different opinion about some of these. One of them I learned a few years back was that when you're creating an input element on a form, that it's always a good idea to place that input element inside of a label element, such that whether you click on the label text or on the actual input, it's going to direct the attention to that input. Now, I know this is equivalent to having the label separate from the input and using the for tag and the name, but I've always found this method to be cleaner. But I'd love to know your opinion on it.
Yeah, that one is usually. I mean, I most of the times I go just with that one because it's just easy to remember, right? And you don't have to do like users can click on the text and the checkbox or the element is always gonna be active, right? Like if it is an input, it's gonna be focused. If it is a checkbox, it's gonna be checked, right? Without having to check. And this is important because this is a cool trick that you don't have to click on the little checkbox. You know, I mean, you probably have visited a lot of websites and you click the label or you click the text and nothing happens. You have to go click the little check mark, and that's kind of like, it's an annoyance, right? So just doing that or using the label for that covers that. The only times when I use label for is when the design requires it. So if the design has like, for some reason is separate, there's some element in between, right? That's when I use label for. Other than that, I default to using the label wrapping the whole input. But yeah, that one is a neat one. I like that one.
Yeah, I also recently had the experience of I was creating a custom file selector, and what's really neat about it is if you put that input inside that label, you can then hide the label with not the label, but the input element with CSS, and then as long as you still click on the label, it triggers the file selector to get clicked, such that it then opens up the dialog. So
yeah, and that's a common use case because when we want to do file uploads, usually we don't use anymore like the click the browse and the little out of the box, right? Because it doesn't match our designs, right? So that's a neat trick to get a nice style and you will still get the out of the box browsing experience.
Yeah, totally. Another little element that I wanted to share, and I learned this one a couple years back, is there's an element called the data list element. And it's very similar to the select element in that, it gives you like a list of options to select from. However, the cool thing about the data list element is that it actually has a little search bar in it that you can search, and it will reduce the options down. And this is just completely out of the box. You don't need to add anything special. If your design asks for something different, then yeah, you might have to do something different. But if you just need a selector and you want a little search functionality in it, it's really easy. The select element actually does have a sense of a search in it built in, but it's less intuitive than the data list element.
Yeah, that one I haven't used it much, but yeah, I've played with it. Yeah, but yeah, no, there's so many elements out there. I mean, I see like sometimes like elements I didn't know they existed. I mean, so it's good to do refreshers on that. I want to share. So I want to share like, let's share three. Let's share three topics here, three tips here. One of the ones that I think are very important is that you have the ID attribute that you can add to any HTML element, right? And they're powerful they're commonly used for two reasons. One reason is when you want to do some JavaScript on that element, right? It's a good way to find it. Another reason to have an ID is because maybe you're doing end-to-end automation, right? You're automating your UI test, and IDs are an easy way to find these elements. So I want to share two good practices about IDs. The first one, and this one I've seen a lot of engineers making the mistake on this one, which is IDs must be unique. Okay, so when you have an ID in the page, that ID, whatever string you set that ID to, right? If it is 1, 2, 3, I mean, there are strings, right? There are attributes and there are strings in HTML there because you're putting in the quotes. Make sure they are unique across the whole page. Whatever is loaded at that time, it has to be unique. If it is not unique, The page is not going to break, but only the first match is the one that is going to be found and used. So if you're using end-to-end automation, and let's say you have 10 buttons and use the same ID button or something like that, it's going to find just the first one. So keep that in mind. The second thing is like when you are doing, for example, you are doing, like you're putting classes, applying classes to your HTML. So the class is another attribute, right? And you can send a list of classes like separated with the spaces, right? Use the identifier of the class, the name of the class, to style this with CSS. If you have some sort of styling, or you need to find, let's say, all the elements that match certain class, but this is just used from JavaScript. The second best practice I really love, and I learned this from the Airbnb style guide, is that you prefix it, the class, with the JS prefix. So you do JS dash, the name of your class, and those classes are the classes you are using just to do some JavaScript binding on your HTML. So this keeps a clean separation of the styles, the classes that are styling the page, versus I need water, sorry, versus the actual JavaScript that is you are using to find or style or do something with different matches using classes. So that's the tip there. The prefix, JS dash, the name of the class, and make sure the IDs are unique. And these are super important. These are the ones you never forget. What do you think of that, Jared?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. It's I mean, in general, a lot of the times, classes will be used pretty exclusively in a lot of cases for styling purposes. But if there is a certain circumstance where you need to access an element by its class in the JavaScript, using some other library or what have you, then yeah, putting that little JS prefix on there is going to be crucial. One thing I'd add on that I've also learned over the years is a good best practice is if you're going to use IDs and classes, I personally prefer to, when I'm naming my IDs, to use camel case. And then with classes, I prefer to use kebab case. So just a really quick point on that is like kebab case is all lowercase with dashes in between each word, where camel case is the first word is going to be lowercase, and then all subsequent words, the first letter is going to be capitalized. And that also helps draw, I think, some clear distinction. But I would recommend as a best practice is making sure your class names are consistent. If you copy a bit of code off the internet and they use a different casing of classes, update it, put it so that, they're going to be consistent with your standards, what you're building is definitely something to keep in mind. To add on to what Juan was saying there, a big don't that in regards to style and HTML is don't ever use inline HTML attribute styles. So if you see that little attribute style equals double quotes, don't do that. Use a class, reference it. Don't use the style inline there.
Okay. No, that's good. Good extra info, right? Good tips on that, on the ID. Yeah, I did like the naming convention. Like I use a different one, but there's no right or wrong as long as you're consistent and your IDs are unique. Everything should be fine. Awesome. So yeah, let's share one more tip each. So let's do one more tip, one more tip, and then let's do our recap.
Yeah, definitely. I think for my last tip, going back to forms, and I learned this one a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago, is normally when you have a form element and you have all your inputs on the inside, by default, if you put a button inside that form and you click that button, it's going to submit your form. Well, there's a little trick to still have a button inside of it without causing it to do that, right? So for example, let's say you have a cancel button and a submit button. Well, you don't want that cancel button to also submit the form. So you can actually add a special attribute to the button called type equals button. And the default is that's being assumed is type equals submit. But yeah, you can put that type equals button and it will prevent your form from submitting. So rather than having to manage like the form being submitted, but the wrong element and then catching it and stopping the event propagation, you can just put that on there, put your on-click listener and have it do what you expect it to do.
Yeah, that one is important because that one always gets me, like creating a form and then putting the buttons and then it's like they're submitting the buttons you don't want to submit, right? So yeah, the type attribute, that one is good. Did you know if there's any other type attribute besides button and submit? Are those two the only ones?
I don't personally know, but I would imagine there might be. There likely would be. Do you know?
No, I think only those two. I'm not sure, but now I'm gonna research that. Okay, awesome. So yeah, I want to share two. Well, I mean, one more tip, and they're kind of related, right? I mean, one like really when you mention thinking about this, you were talking about accessibility, right? And we probably can do a whole episode on accessibility at some point, but um, one of the things that are very important is like a lot of customers or clients or users of the applications I build, they use their keyboard and only their keyboard, right? They are because they need to move fast, right, through the forms and stuff. So a good practice when you're building your HTML, and Jared mentioned this about like the ordering, right, like the index for the tab index, is that there's two tests that you should be doing with your website. One test is that try to navigate your whole website without using the mouse. So just like use tab and try to see if it is accessible that way. So that's one that is very important, especially when you're creating forms. It shouldn't be jumping around, right? So you want to have those indexes set so it navigates in the order. Let's say you have a horizontal form, right? You don't want it to go down. You want it to go like first left to right, right? So depending on how you're doing layout, you might want to set those indexes. So that's a very important thing there, and that has to do with accessibility. The other thing is about headings, right? So, like we take for granted H1, H2, H3, H4, 5, 6, right? But these headings, they have also a semantic value, right? Especially for screen readers and SEO, right? So one tip that I always like to bring out is that every page should have a H1 tag present, okay? Every page. But this H1 tag doesn't have to be the title of the page because you already have the title of the page in the head meta tag, right? So always remember that because this is going to help you with indexing, SEO, and accessibility out of the box. Because look, I mean, you got all these things out of the box, and all you had to remember was adding the H1 tag. So yeah. So have you thought about those two, Jared?
Yeah, I've definitely like implicitly thought about them, but I can't say that I've really, made it a point to make sure that I'm checking that, right? That, yeah, again, like you say, like Juan's saying, being able to check to make sure that your website is navigatable by a keyboard, not just for people with disabilities, but also certain power users. Actually, there's kind of a Venn diagram circle that includes those people. And I think it's really valuable to just go and try it out, right? Go to your website right now and see whether or not you can navigate it. And if you can't, well, maybe go add some tab indexes, see how you can improve that experience.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, cool. So we're out of time. So let's go ahead and do our recap. So we're going to test our memory here, Jared. So let's share the things we talked about. Just let's list them, right? So our audience can write them down and research. Remember, you have homework with this podcast. We're just giving you the high level things, and you have to go write them down, research them, right, and learn everything you can about them. I mean, this is not a comprehensive guide in 30 minutes, right? We just want to expose you and give you exposure based on our experience. So, yeah, since you started, do the recap of the items you shared that you remember.
Yeah. So right at the top, we talked about semantic elements and why they're important. We talked about forms and different aspects of, how to create labels and inputs and submit buttons and things like that. We talked more broadly about accessibility. Now, of course, it's definitely, we skimmed the surface, but there's lots of more topics to go into. And also, we talked a little bit about HTML attributes and the vast sea of them that are available that you can use to connect into. Which ones do you remember, Juan?
Yeah. So the head, right? So have a title, right? The viewport, super important. We talked about the IDs, must be unique. For classes, if you're using classes with JavaScript bindings, have a prefix, JS dash. The Adblock Test, right? So enable the Adblock, run the site and see if it still works, right? Your JavaScript is not breaking. So then you can fix it because that's going to affect the engagement with your clients. Customers will complain. There's the keyword test, right? So test your website with the whole keyword. And I think I'm missing, the required attributes, right? We talked about that. So the spec has them, but the IMG required attribute, that's one that we mentioned, the alt attribute. And And I think that's it. I mean, I have the feeling we're missing one on the recap, but yeah, I think that's pretty much summarizes it. So yeah, awesome. So yeah, that's it for today. So thank you so much for listening. This was Juan Lizarazo,
And this is Jared Potter.
and we'll see you next week.